Chapter 46, Outside the Walls. The Pictish borderlands were nothing like the world within the city's walls. Where Pict was a marvel of human ingenuity, a soaring testament to the harmony of magic and industry, the lands beyond it were primal and merciless. The spires of the War College, the distant hum of the Nexus weave, and the structured predictability of life within civilization were all distant memories the moment Ava and her team entered the wilds. Here, in the deep woods where mana pooled in rich densities and where the creatures of the multiverse roamed untethered, life and death were measured in seconds, in inches, in the sheer force of will. Ava moved like a predator, her footfalls silent against the damp loam, the scent of wet foliage mixing with the faint metallic tang of mana-rich air. Her team was spread out in a loose formation, a pack of apex hunters rather than a disciplined regiment. It was something she had come to respect deeply in the past year. Each of them had been a dominant force on their own, a lone conqueror of battlefields. Together, their cohesion was not forced but natural, their independence melding seamlessly into a perfect, lethal rhythm. She could feel the system's favor pressing against her, an unseen force pushing her toward growth, toward evolution. It was what she had come to love about real combat. Unlike the scholars who buried themselves in research and the cultivators who meditated in their chambers for years at a time, she had learned the truth. The gods rewarded those who took their fate into their own hands. Experience, the raw, unfiltered kind, was a path of power that could not be substituted. Joseph's magic wove through the team like an unseen thread, his druidic affinity allowing him to maintain an active link between all of them. Catiline, their scout and ranged combatant, was somewhere ahead, hidden within the thick underbrush of the borderlands. The rest of them, Fillory, Morgana, Stefan, and Ava, were closing in on the target, their movement disciplined, purposeful. Ava's thoughts wandered briefly as they followed the tracks, as they hunted this thing that had crossed into their world through the unseen corridors of the Nexus Spire. She had turned 20 on this hunt, but there had been no celebration. No fanfare. The day had come and gone, another mile covered, another battle looming on the horizon. It was exactly how she wanted it. Her team had fought raiders from the Hall of Matchmaking twice now, and both times had only solidified what she already believed, that the system was fair in the way the gods wove battle. The first ambush had come in the dead of night, the telltale crackle of displaced air warning them too late of an incoming portal rip. One moment, the only sounds had been the chirp of insects and the rustle of leaves. The next, the air had warped, and men had poured through in a rush of steel and sorcery. The Hall of Matchmaking's raiders weren't the disorganized brigands that most of the world assumed them to be. They were trained, well-equipped, and ruthless. The fight had been vicious. Morgana had torn through them like a shadow of death, her gravity magic collapsing their ranks into crushing spheres of warping force. Catiline had cut down their spellcasters before they could stabilize their portal, while Fillory had stood as an unbreakable bastion, weathering blow after blow until they turned the tide. Ava had barely been thinking, barely aware of her own movements. Her nova magic had erupted, micro-flares and collapsing stars detonating through their ranks until only cinders remained. It had been beautiful. The second encounter had been more organized. A larger force, a planned engagement rather than a chance encounter. The system had balanced the field in a way she found fascinating. They had faced off against a raider captain and his personal retinue, a battle fought in the dying light of the evening. It had been a dance of destruction, each side testing the other, feeling for weaknesses. Ava had faced an opponent unlike any before, a swordsman who moved like the wind, his blade drinking in magic like a bottomless abyss. He had nearly cut her down before she overcharged her body with gravity magic and moved at speeds beyond his comprehension, her palm striking his chest with the full force of a collapsing sun. The battle had ended in their victory, the remnants of the raider force scattering back into the halls of the gods. Ava still called it a system, even though she knew it was the will of the gods. It was an old habit, one that she shared with Morgana. It was one of the odd quirks that had lingered with her since childhood, one of the strange echoes of her long-lost friend, Wolfhart. That name still stirred something in her. Anger, frustration, regret. He had vanished so thoroughly, so utterly, that it was as if he had never existed at all. A shadow burned into her memories, a presence that no longer had a place in her life but refused to be forgotten. She pushed it down, forced it away. She had no time for ghosts. Just like she had no time for birthdays, not telling the group that they had hunted right through her 20. Joseph's voice broke through the link, sharp and urgent. We found it. It's big. Prepare to rush it. Adrenaline surged through Ava's veins, burning away the lingering thoughts. The time for reflection was over. The team moved as one. Fillory was the first in line, his massive frame a living shield as they emerged from the dense brush. Ava saw it then, the thing they had been hunting. It stood in a clearing, illuminated by the eerie glow of the mana-rich air around it. A centaur-like beast, but nothing like the ones of legend. Its lower half was massive, equine in structure but covered in thick, chitinous plating that shimmered with the telltale glow of Nexus energies. Its upper half was not human, but a hulking primate with a silver-backed mane and a face twisted in perpetual rage. Its arms were thick as tree trunks, its hands massive enough to crush a man in an instant. And its eyes burned with the raw, unfathomable power of something that did not belong in this world. The creature turned, nostrils flaring as it scented them, its massive hands clenching into fists. It knew they were here. Ava's blood sang with the thrill of it. She didn't hesitate. She ran. Her first step cracked the ground beneath her as she flooded her limbs with overcharged gravity magic, her body launching forward with impossible speed. Fillory roared as he charged beside her, his blade wreathed in flame, a burning wall of death. Morgana was already weaving gravitational distortions, the air around them warping as the field tilted to their advantage. Catiline had taken position in the trees, her arrows already loosed, each one singing with lethal intent. The beast bellowed, its voice shaking the forest. The hunt was on. The moment the beast roared, the air ignited with the promise of battle. The team engaged like a well-tuned war machine, every member moving with the lethal grace of those who had honed their craft through years of combat training and hard work. Ava felt the surge of power coil in her limbs, the gravitational shifts of Morgana's magic making her feel weightless for half a heartbeat before stabilizing the moment she hit her stride. Morgana, always one step ahead, wove the battlefield to their advantage. The very fabric of space seemed to distort under her will, dark gravitational tethers lashing out like coiling serpents. They clung to the beast's equine legs, winding around its massive silver-backed torso, dragging at its joints with unseen force. The creature bellowed, fighting the invisible bonds, but Morgana was relentless, her power shifting and twisting like a black tide. Fillory took full advantage of this. His armor, usually a weighty burden that slowed his movements, became light as a feather under Morgana's precise control. The Knight of Flame surged forward with blinding speed, his blade cutting through the air like a streak of molten gold. The heat of his strikes burned through the rain-slicked foliage, each swing carving arcs of fire into the damp earth. His weapon met the beast's plated hide, searing into it with a hiss of burning flesh, yet the creature did not fall easily. It reared onto its hind legs, its simian upper body twisting with unnatural agility, and swung one of its enormous arms down with terrifying force. Fillory barely dodged. The ground cracked beneath the impact of the beast's strike, dirt and stone exploding outward. Catiline was already in motion. From her position in the trees, the huntress loosed a barrage of arrows, each one a deadly missile enchanted with precision magic. Her specialty was adaptability, she could seamlessly swap between ranged weapons and close-quarters combat with her enchanted spear, but for now, she worked from a distance, her arrows seeking the beast's joints, its throat, its eyes. The creature flinched as one found purchase, lodging deep into the softer flesh at the base of its throat. It wheezed, blood misting from its open maw. Stefan was next, his presence a shadow weaving through the chaos. Where Morgana commanded gravity, Stefan manipulated darkness itself, his magic coalescing into writhing tendrils of void. The black threads lashed out, snaring the beast's limbs, coiling around its wrists, twisting through the air like living entities. They tightened, pulling against Morgana's gravitational bindings, forcing the creature further off balance. It struggled, but the weight of their combined power bore down upon it. The beast roared again, a sound that vibrated through Ava's very bones. Its raw strength was terrifying, a creature born of mana-dense worlds, tempered by the chaos of the Nexus itself. But this was the moment she had been waiting for. Ava surged forward, her body a conduit for the power of the stars themselves. Fire and gravity merged within her, a harmony of destruction and control. She channeled the force into her limbs, her breath steady, her mind singular in focus. As the beast fought against the bindings of her teammates, she leapt. Gravity shifted mid-air, her trajectory adjusting in an instant as Morgana subtly lent her support. Ava twisted, her palms radiating heat that singed the very air around her. The nova flared, a miniature sun compressed into the space of her clenched fists. She struck. The impact was cataclysmic. The sheer weight of her solar force crashed into the creature's plated skull, the gravitational energy magnifying the blow 100-fold. There was a sickening crunch as the beast's defenses shattered, its entire form cratering into the earth with a final, shuddering roar. The light from her attack washed over the battlefield, the very air shimmering with the aftershock of condensed stellar energy. Then, silence. Ava's breath came in ragged gasps, her body pulsing with the after-effects of channeling such an immense force. She stepped back, her vision adjusting as the dust settled, as the scent of charred flesh and scorched mana filled the clearing. The beast's massive form lay still, its once imposing presence now nothing more than a husk. And then, it happened. The true prize of their hunt, the thing they had been chasing all along, materialized from the dissipating energy of the slain creature. A rift, a gateway of impossible beauty, unfurled itself in the space just above the beast's corpse. A golden blue portal shimmered into existence, the very fabric of reality bending around its luminous edges. It pulsed with raw mana, its light casting eerie shadows across the team's astonished faces. For a long moment, none of them moved, all caught in the same breath of awe. "This is it," Stefan said, his voice filled with something between reverence and excitement. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his dark cloak barely shifting as he crossed the threshold and disappeared into the light. Ava's pulse pounded in her ears. This was it. The thing they had only theorized about, the thing they had trained for, planned for. None of them had ever stepped through this kind of portal before. The anticipation, the adrenaline, the sheer potential of what lay beyond, it was intoxicating. She didn't wait. Ava took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and strode forward with the confidence of someone who had fought for every inch of her power. The moment her foot touched the threshold, reality unraveled. Everything went white. Her body was weightless, her senses stretching, expanding, warping. It wasn't like teleportation or standard portal magic. This was something greater, something beyond mere transportation. She felt herself being pulled, restructured, rewritten by forces she could not begin to comprehend. And then, a voice. Not one of her teammates, not Morgana or Stefan, not even her own thoughts. "Welcome to the halls of matchmaking." And the world around her changed. Chapter 47, The Halls of the Gods. Ava's vision pulsed white, her senses stretched and twisted as if her body was being unraveled and rewoven at the same time. For a moment, there was nothing but formless existence, weightless, soundless, sightless. And then, the world snapped back into place. She staggered slightly, her boots touching down on an impossibly smooth floor. Around her, the rest of her team emerged one by one, blinking into existence like phantoms materializing from mist. And then, the grandeur of the place truly hit her. The halls of matchmaking. It was overwhelming. Unlike anything she had ever seen or imagined. The space was vast, seemingly endless in every direction, an opulent convergence of divine architecture and modern function. The ceiling, if it could be called that, was an ever-shifting dome of constellations, galaxies unfurling and collapsing in slow motion, nebulae pulsing with ethereal radiance. It was as if the very heavens had been woven into the structure, a constant, shimmering reminder of the cosmic scale of where they stood. But it wasn't just the sky above that left Ava breathless. The halls were alive with motion, sound, and power. A marketplace and a battleground, a space of divinely ordained commerce and war preparation. Towering colonnades of celestial marble ran along the length of the hall, breaking up the vast expanse into elaborate wings of interconnected paths, each leading to some corner of this godly domain. It was part Colosseum, part marketplace, part throne room of the gods. Everywhere, people of all races moved, their glowing wristbands marking them as chosen competitors in this grand, celestial game. Warriors clad in gleaming armor strode purposefully toward merchant stalls filled with divine wares, their faces set with the grim determination of battle-hardened veterans. Others lounged in designated waiting areas, watching massive hovering displays that cycled through different battlefields, replaying past encounters between raiders and whatever horrors lurked in the realms beyond the portals. Ava took a slow, measured breath, feeling the sheer density of power around her. The people here weren't mere soldiers. They were elites, killers, champions drawn from 1,000 worlds, all gathered in one place to test themselves in combat across the multiverse. As she adjusted to the surreal beauty of the halls, her gaze flicked down to her wrist. A glowing bracelet had materialized there, smooth, metallic, with intricate divine script engraved across its band. The moment she focused on it, the text shifted, rearranging itself into something she could read. Raid timer, 2 hours. Soul coins, 97. Ava blinked. She had almost 100 soul coins. The others were checking their own bands, murmuring as they came to similar realizations. They had gained far more than expected, not just from the hunt, but from their battles against the raiders. The system, or whatever divine entity governed this place, had deemed their combat against the enemies of the gods worthy of significant rewards. Stefan was the first to speak, his voice carrying the quiet intensity of barely restrained excitement. "We don't need to stick together for the next 2 hours," he said, scanning the hall like a man already planning 5 moves ahead. "The gods will send each of us a portal when it's our time. When that happens, don't hesitate, they'll force you through if you wait too long, and you'll get a penalty for cowardice." Ava's eyes flicked toward the massive gates set into the far end of the hall, colossal, glowing doorways leading into unknown realms, each one waiting for a warrior to step forward and be judged by combat. Stefan continued, "Once we're through, we'll have moments to strategize before we're thrown into battle. This isn't like raiding outside the walls, we won't know what's waiting for us on the other side. We'll have to adapt instantly." The weight of those words sank into Ava's bones. This wasn't just a test of power, but reaction speed, battlefield awareness, teamwork. Stefan's gaze swept over them all. "Any items we can get will be invaluable. We may never return here, so spend your soul coins while you have them." He took a step back, nodding toward the towering merchant wings lining the halls, their glowing signs displaying divine artifacts, enchanted weaponry, alchemical elixirs, and relics of forgotten wars. Ava barely heard the rest. She was already walking, her pulse quickening as she made her way toward the nearest shop. The merchant district of the halls was a marvel unto itself. Unlike the chaotic street markets of Pict or the well-ordered guild stores of the War College, these stalls were perfectly symmetrical, their structures seemingly grown from the very fabric of the hall rather than built by mortal hands. Each one was dedicated to a specific type of raid equipment, from weapons and armor to spell-infused consumables, all available only to those who had earned their place here. Ava passed a stall selling ancient war banners, each imbued with battlefield-wide enchantments that could shift the tide of combat. Another displayed shimmering vials of mana-infused blood, promising instantaneous rejuvenation at a cost. A third stall held floating silver orbs, whispering the names of the heroes they had belonged to before their deaths, promising power at the risk of binding one's fate to the spirit within. It was overwhelming. Ava's breath came short as she forced herself to focus. She needed something practical. Something that would enhance her strength, not weigh her down with complications. Her eyes darted across the options, scanning for anything that called to her. She wasn't the kind to buy on impulse. Years of training, of refining herself, had taught her the value of patience. She moved through the maze of divine vendors, her sharp eyes scanning over the wares. Potent battle relics, ancient spell catalysts, even enchanted armor that hummed with stored power. Each was enticing in its own way, but none called to her. None of them felt right. Then, she saw it. It was a simple thing, nestled amongst a dozen other trinkets at an unassuming stall, barely drawing any attention amidst the displays of divine weaponry and shimmering potions. The amulet was shaped like a swirling cosmic spiral, its metalwork depicting tiny stars orbiting a central nexus, a miniature model of the Nexus of Worlds itself. But it wasn't its appearance that made her stop. It was the pull. A deep, instinctual resonance that surged through her veins the moment she laid eyes on it. It was not magic, nor power, at least, not as she had ever known it. It was something older, deeper, something that bypassed reason and went straight to the core of her being. Ava never acted on gut feelings alone, but this was different. She reached for it without thinking, her fingers closing around the delicate chain. The moment she touched it, a pulse of warmth traveled through her palm, radiating up her arm. A message shimmered across the air above it, an ethereal description written in a script that rearranged itself for her understanding. Amulet of Stardew. The seeds of life, when held in the light of a star, create a bond eternity cannot break. That was it. That was all it said. Nothing about combat enhancements, nothing about how it functioned. And yet, Ava knew. This was worth it. She looked up at the vendor, a figure cloaked in an indistinct shifting robe, their features unreadable. They studied her in turn, the shadows beneath their hood unreadable, yet she sensed amusement in their presence. As if they had been expecting her. "Price?" Ava asked. The vendor hummed. "For you?" Their voice was layered, like a chorus speaking in unison. 70 soul coins. Ava felt something shift in the air between them, something imperceptible but undeniable. That price was low, far too low for something like this. Others might have seen it as suspicious, but Ava had spent years mastering instinct in battle. Right now, it was screaming at her to take the offer. She narrowed her eyes, watching the vendor for any sign of deception. "Why so cheap?" she asked. A chuckle, soft and distant, like a whisper between stars. "Because it is meant for you, child of flame." That should have unnerved her. But instead, it only confirmed what she already knew. Ava exhaled sharply and handed over the required soul coins. The bracelet on her wrist pulsed, her balance dropping significantly, but she barely noticed. The vendor gently placed the amulet into her hand, their form already beginning to fade into the background, as if they had never truly been there to begin with. Ava clenched the amulet in her palm. She had no idea what it did. And yet, she had never been more certain of anything in her life. Time was slipping away, her raid was approaching. She moved quickly back through the halls, the amulet resting heavy against her chest, its warmth subtly pulsing with every beat of her heart. As she neared the area where her team had first materialized, she spotted Morgana Ash lounging in one of the designated rest areas. It was a spacious watching gallery, where massive refractive surfaces hung in the air like windows into other worlds, broadcasting the ongoing raids from different groups across the Nexus. Morgana noticed her approach and smirked. "Get anything good?" Ava nodded but didn't elaborate. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the screens, where a raid was already in progress. The battle unfolding before them was vicious. A squad of 5 warriors was locked in brutal combat against a colossal, shifting construct, its form constantly rewriting itself as it adapted to their tactics. One fighter, a spear-wielding knight, launched himself into the air, his weapon glowing with divine sigils. Before he could land his strike, the creature's body morphed. What had been solid metal a moment ago turned fluid, catching the knight midair and crushing him like a fist closing around glass. Ava felt a shiver crawl down her spine. The next raid over showed something equally brutal, a group of spellcasters, surrounded by writhing tendrils of black mist, their very shadows rebelling against them. One tried to teleport away, only for his own shadow to anchor him to the ground, dragging him screaming into the consuming abyss. Morgana watched with interest. And people volunteer for this. Ava exhaled slowly. It's what we're here for. They both knew the truth. This was a game of survival, a test set by the gods to weed out the weak and cultivate the strong. Those who entered the halls of matchmaking did not come here to simply fight, they came here to ascend. Ava gripped the amulet against her chest. Soon, it would be their turn. Chapter 48, Lesson 3. I had long since abandoned the pain cube. It was no longer necessary. It had served its purpose, an elementary construct to withstand Volume's torments, a first refuge from insanity, a controlled space where I could mitigate the raw agony of my existence. But that had been hundreds of cycles ago. Now, I lived in the plane of pain itself. Pain was no longer something I endured. It was something I existed within, something I had become. The ascended being, Volume, had created this prison to break me, to separate me from Hexa, to wear down the tenuous existence we shared until there was nothing left. He had failed. Instead, he had become my battery. His prison, his body, his very presence, it all bled mana into the air, a density so thick it could have drowned lesser beings in its weight. But I was no lesser being. I had mastered the art of consumption. Every second, my body, my mana-adaptable blood, drank in more power than it was meant to contain, overloading me, forcing my cells into an endless cycle of destruction and renewal, perpetually tethering me to the dimension of pain. This was my cultivation. And within the endless furnace of suffering, I had refined myself. Volume had long since ceased his games. There was no point anymore. He had once delighted in the slow, methodical way he broke down my body, peeling away my flesh, remolding it into his art of pain and reconstruction. But now, he only ran the necessary healing cycles, the bare minimum to keep me from dying outright. Because he had learned. No matter what he did, I consumed more. Grew stronger. Every second, every hour, every cycle, I was expanding, stretching, becoming something else. This was my war. Each battle fought on the board of my mind, each stone placed, each game against Hex's intermediate model, was a clash of armies. No longer were these simply abstract formations, distant concepts of control and territory. Now, they were visceral, each play a campaign of blood, each move a duel to the death. When I placed my stones upon the board, I did not merely imagine the pieces. I became them. Every maneuver, every formation Hexa devised against me, I was thrown into the bodies of my troops, fighting at the front lines, feeling the struggle firsthand. Every blade meeting flesh, every arrow piercing through defenses, every encroachment upon my territory was experienced as a warrior at the edge of his limits, holding the line. Hex's white stones advanced upon my position, and I fought them back in screaming melee, feeling my bones shatter, my lungs burn, my body crumble beneath the sheer weight of attrition. But I held on. I fought, I bled, I died, and I resurrected in the next piece I placed. Again. And again. And again. Until, finally, the last stone fell. The last enemy was cut down. The go board was mine. I had won. I exhaled, my mind shuddering at the raw exertion. I had no breath, no lungs to burn, and yet I still felt the phantom sensation, the deep ache of a battle fought with everything I had. I did not revel in it. I simply acknowledged it. I turned my focus away from the battlefield and into the palace of my mind, the place I had constructed deep within the folds of my own pain. It had become my refuge, a place of calm, a thing that could not be touched by volume, nor disrupted by the chaos of my ever-burning existence. It was an underwater palace, something out of myth, a domain submerged beneath the cooling currents of my own suffering. Within its halls, Hexa sat upon her usual seat, the form she had taken here that of a lounging cat, tail flicking idly, perched upon the edge of my tea table as though she had always belonged there. Her golden feline eyes narrowed as she stretched lazily, voice dripping with that ever-condescending amusement. Lesson 3, she intoned, her words cutting through the stillness. I sat across from her, watching. Lesson 3, she repeated, is that our natures are not our own. The words settled, hanging in the air like the weight of an executioner's axe. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then, finally, I spoke. What do you mean? Hexa's whiskers twitched, her gaze sharp and knowing. I mean that you are not who you think you are, Wolfhart. I mean that I am not who I think I am. She flicked an ear, her tail swishing across the table. And that is because neither of us are whole. Silence rang between us. I narrowed my eyes. You're saying? Hexa sighed, the sound carrying an unnatural weight, like the admission of something long kept hidden. Even I did not realize it at first. But Johnathan Walsh is dead. And Wolfhart Valda Ashdock, the child that was meant to be, is also dead. My blood ran cold. That made no sense. Hexa's golden eyes burned with intensity as she continued. When I altered the child that was meant to be you, when I fused you with the empty shell of his existence, I thought I had simply supplanted him. That you were all that remained. But I was wrong. I felt something inside me twist. Wolfhart was not erased, Hexa said, each word precise, deliberate, lethal. He was merely buried. Suppressed. I stared at her, my mind fracturing under the revelation. My whole existence had been built upon the understanding that I was me. That I was Johnathan, reborn, given a second chance in a world that had no place for my old self. That my past life had been a foundation, and Wolfhart had been the vessel. But now, Hexa was telling me that wasn't true. That I was not alone inside my own body. That's why, Hexa continued, her voice low, you are the way you are. Your impatience, your impulsiveness, your hunger for the void, they are not just yours. They are also his. The weight of her words crushed down upon me. The person who Wolfhart would have been was still there? Not in memory. Not in fragments. But in something else. Something suppressed. A homunculus of a being trapped inside me. Inside us. My throat felt dry. And what happens if he wakes up? Hexa blinked slowly, her feline expression unreadable. I don't know. I am not sure he can. I clenched my fists. Everything I had ever known about myself had just shattered my understanding of identity like dust on the wind. But I had no time for identity crises. No time for doubts. Volume still loomed. The prison still held. The war was not over. So I meditated on the revelation deeply. Looking inward where he had been buried inside me. Years passed in my palace chambers. And I looked at Hexa. Fine, I said, my voice steel. Then let's move to lesson 4. She smiled. The war was far from over. And I had only just begun to fight. Chapter 49, The Call of Family. Halric had never seen anything like the capital of Ash. The sheer weight of it pressed against his senses, the towering brutalist spires, the layers of arcane infrastructure, the endless pulsing mana that saturated the air like the smell of burning iron. A city built upon conquest, forged through war, and tempered by ambition. His eyes flicked between the immense gilded banners of noble houses, the sweeping skybridges, and the distant, looming silhouette of the Grand Academy, its massive obsidian pillars etched with runes of power. It was overwhelming. It was exhilarating. And it was infuriating. Not for the first time since arriving, Halric clenched his fists and reminded himself why he was here. This was meant to be a glorious time for Valda Ashdock, his home, his future, his legacy. The elders had finally approved his proposal, something unheard of in generations. Population expansion. A step forward. A move toward cityhood. Toward something greater. It would be difficult. With each new settler, the weekly raids would only increase in intensity. The challenges would multiply. But Halric had never feared battle. He had never feared the weight of responsibility. He had striven for this moment, fought for this moment, bled for this moment. And he would not build it alone. That was why he had come to the capital. That was why he had to find them. Wolfhart. Ava. The two strongest people he had ever known. His younger brother, his childhood friend, his last ties to a past long buried. For months now, the town had heard nothing from either of them. Wolfhart's letters had grown cold. Ava had disappeared altogether. At first, Halric had been patient. He had assumed their success in the capital had simply made them busy. But as time stretched, that patience eroded into a festering worry. Now, he was here, to pull them home. To remind them that Valda Ashdok was more than just a birthplace. It was a future. A place to build something real. A place where they could all grow old. A place where they could be more than just ghosts of the past. He imagined Wolfhart's laugh, that odd, too clever for his own good smirk. He imagined Ava's fire, her relentless will, the way she lit up a battlefield like a living comet. He needed them. And if his little brother was being stubborn, Halric would drag him home if he had to. But as days passed, a creeping unease settled in his chest. No one in the capital of Ash seemed to know Wolfhart at all. At first, it had seemed normal enough. He had asked the academy officials, the people who ran the dormitories, the merchant houses that dealt with students. Nothing. Then he had gone to the bars. Still nothing. Then the lower city, the places where Wolfhart would have slipped through, where he would have found odd jobs, where he would have left a mark. Still. Nothing. Ava? She had left. That much had been clear. Her name carried weight. She was something of a celebrity now, the solo mage of great renown, the girl who had graduated alone, a name whispered in taverns, praised in the military circuits, talked about in hushed tones among those who understood power. She had taken an offer at the World College of War and picked. And Halric, despite the aching pull in his chest, knew better than to follow her. She was beyond him now. He had always harbored feelings, but they were just that, feelings. She belonged to a different world. A world of elites, of magic, of power beyond reckoning. He would not hold her back. He would not be that kind of man. But Wolfhart? His own flesh and blood? Why was there no trace of him? No records. No sightings. Not a single damn soul in this massive city knew his name. It made no sense. His little brother had been a brilliant kid. He would have done something notable. Even if he had failed, he would have left something behind. But there was nothing. Just a void. Like he had never existed at all. Halric felt himself breaking, the weight of it all crushing down on him as the days stretched into despair. He had resorted to walking through the streets, calling Wolfhart's name, desperate, angry, a man hunting the ghost of someone who should not be dead. That was when he heard the laughter. A cackling, broken sound, wheezing through the filthy gutters of the lower district. Halric turned. A man, no, something that had once been a man, lay in the filth of the alley, his limbs missing, his eyes hollowed out, his form nothing but a ruin of flesh and madness. And yet, he was laughing. Halric froze. The wretched creature tilted his head, his toothless grin stretching wider. Oh, ho ho, the beggar rasped. You know Fish Boy? Halric's entire body locked. The filth-covered thing let out another choked, gleeful cackle, his remaining fingers twitching. He pointed, his stump of an arm jerking toward the darkness of the alley, as if following the echo of Wolfhart's name. Bring him to Old Bill, the blind beggar wheezed, his ruined sockets grinning. Old Bill. That name. That damned name. Halric's breath turned to ice. He still owes me an eye, the beggar continued, giggling. 2 feet. And a hand. If he's alive, I hope he is. So I can take them myself. A knife of dread carved through Halric's gut. His heart pounded. His mind reeled. He stared at the wretched thing, the man who should have been nothing more than a mad beggar in the streets. But he knew Wolfhart. Knew him by name. Knew him as Fish Boy. And worst of all, he was laughing. Halric grabbed him by the collar, his voice a snarl of barely restrained rage. How do you know my brother? The beggar just grinned, his breath reeking of rot. Kid's probably dead, he crooned, as if mocking. Haven't heard his name in years. Thought he was long gone. Oh, but he was a slippery one. The beggar giggled again. He stole from the worst people. Halric's blood ran cold. Ran drugs for Old Bill. Ran worse. The words hit like a hammer, rattling through his skull, shattering his world. His brother? Wolfhart? Drugs? Theft? Running for Old Bill? The filthy old thing kept laughing, his ruined sockets seeming to see more than they should. Poor little Fish Boy, the beggar cooed. Didn't know who he was messing with. Didn't know that when you play the game, you don't get to quit. The air thickened. The city felt too loud, the streets too small. Halric couldn't breathe. His little brother. His stubborn, clever, strange little brother. Gone. Dead. A criminal. A ghost. He didn't remember letting go of the beggar. Didn't remember walking away. Didn't remember the way his feet pounded against the stones as he ran. Ran from the laughter. Ran from the truth. Ran from the unbearable weight of loss. Wolfhart was dead. And when Halric needed him the most, he was gone. Chapter 50, Raiders. The moment Ava stepped through her portal, the gods took her. It was not a sensation of movement, nor falling, nor weightlessness, it was simply transition, an abrupt and all-consuming shift from one existence to the next. The air changed, the gravity itself felt different, and the mana surrounding her condensed so sharply that her body immediately adjusted, reflexively drawing it in. The system's voice was already speaking inside her mind. Objective: overwhelm 50% of the enemy forces or suffer 50% losses within 1 hour. Bonus rewards for exceeding the requirement. Optional extraction available upon completion. As quickly as the words settled into her mind, so too did a deep, instinctual knowledge of the enemy's movements. It was not a map, not a clear visual display, it was simply known, as if the knowledge had always been there, as if she had memorized it a lifetime ago. Ava took a slow breath and blinked. The world around her glowed. It was a jungle, but unlike any she had ever seen. The foliage pulsed with bioluminescent hues, throbbing softly in shades of deep green, ethereal blue, and hints of violet. The plants exuded a low-frequency hum, almost like a living chorus of mana singing its own rhythm. The stars above were wrong. She looked up, expecting to see the Nexus weave stretching across the sky, its vast lattice of cosmic strands interwoven like a web of divine power. But there was nothing. Just blackness. A sinking realization crawled up her spine: they were underground. The cavern that stretched above them was so vast that it housed its own ecosystem, its own atmosphere. The false stars were actually distant bioluminescent fungi, massive and ancient, sprawling across the cavern ceiling like celestial bodies. Ava had seen many incredible things since leaving her home, but this world held a beauty unlike any she had encountered. A primordial glow, a sense of something ancient, untouched by human hands. The roots beneath Joseph's staff began to shift, twisting together into intricate pathways as the druid muttered under his breath, his magic weaving crude topography into the jungle floor. The rough shape of their surroundings took form: a river cut through the cavern, leading to a small village nestled between fungal growths. A fortified settlement. Ava's gaze flicked to the others. They had no time to waste. Stephen was already directing them, his dark eyes scanning the map as he spoke through the magical link that tethered them all. "We've got a single hour before the gods judge us, let's make it count." Joseph's voice crackled over the link, his tone cool and analytical. "I see the targets. They're waiting. They know something is coming." Catiline, ever sharp, cut in. "How many?" A pause. Then Joseph muttered, his voice tinged with something unsettled. "Not many." Ava frowned. "How many exactly?" 2 to 1, maybe, Joseph replied. "We're outnumbered." Ava felt her stomach tighten. Something about that wasn't right. The ambient mana density here was heavier than even picked, so thick that it clung to her skin like a second layer of existence. It was richer, older, potent in a way that should make this place dangerous. If this small village could thrive here, its defenders should be more numerous. So why were there so few? The first one to voice that thought aloud was Philroy, the towering knight of flame. He stood beside Ava, shifting his massive greatsword across his back, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "The gods are underestimating us," he said, cracking his neck. Stephen's dark sorcery wove lazy strands of shadow around his fingertips as he observed the village from their hidden vantage point. His tone was unreadable. "Or they aren't showing their full hand." That was enough for Ava. She forced her nerves into silence, bottled the unease, and focused on what mattered. The plan. The attack. The glory of the hunt. She had trained for this. She had dreamed of this. This was the life she had chosen, the life that would elevate her above all others. A high-risk, high-reward gamble, the kind that forged legends. Ava gritted her teeth, rolling her shoulders as she focused, her magic coiling in her veins like liquid fire. Stephen exhaled slowly. "Move." The team descended. Catiline led them first, slipping through the undergrowth with the silent grace of a shadow, her movements liquid, her enchanted spear whispering through the air with a quiet hum of stored energy. Philroy followed next, a wall of burning presence, his greatsword resting against his shoulder, each of his steps controlled and deliberate. He was impossible to ignore, a titan of violence waiting to be unleashed. Joseph hung toward the back, his druidic power rippling outward. His connection to the roots and vines of this world was unsettling. This was not his first jungle. Morgana stayed close to Ava's flank, her gravity magic pulsing in small bursts around her fingertips, prepared to anchor or accelerate the battle as needed. And Stephen? He was everywhere and nowhere, his dark magic curling around him like living ink, his threads of sorcery drifting through the air like puppeteer's strings. Ava was the last to move, holding her breath for the barest second, drinking in the mana-rich air. And then, they struck. The village erupted. The moment they breached the wooden perimeter, the blue-skinned defenders reacted instantly, their glowing eyes sharp with resolve, their weapons already raised. They had been waiting. Spears glinted beneath the mushroom light, and then, shouts, a clash of metal, a wave of motion. Catiline moved first, her spear blurring as she ripped through the first defender, her weapon shifting in mid-swing to fire a bolt of energy straight into the next target. Filroy was a brute force hurricane, his greatsword tearing through wood and flesh alike, the sheer force of his swing splintering spears like brittle twigs. Joseph's magic slithered through the soil, roots surging upward to wrap around the legs of the closest defenders, locking them in place before crushing them with terrifying force. Stephen's dark threads wove between enemies, slicing into exposed flesh, cutting throats with precision so perfect it was inhuman. And Ava was a supernova. She vaulted over the barricades, her magic igniting the very air, and with a single wave of her hand, she called forth a miniature star. The battlefield turned white. Gravity twisted. The ground itself seemed to bend toward her as she released the nova. A crater blossomed where the first wave of defenders had stood, their bodies instantly vaporized, their weapons melting into slag. The village was already burning. Ava's heart pounded. They were winning. And yet, the battle had only just begun. Ava barely had a moment to relish the destruction before Joseph's voice cut sharply through the magical link. They didn't get caught in the blast, Ava. Her stomach turned to ice. That wasn't possible. She had seen them evaporate, consumed in the core of her miniature starburst, bodies melting like wax in the face of pure celestial heat. She turned, eyes flicking through the glowing embers, seeking proof of their demise. And then, they reformed. Mist coalesced into solid forms, blue-skinned dwarves rising from nothing, their gnarled faces twisted in determination, their bodies untouched by her magic. 15 in total. Not all of them had returned, but enough to turn the tide. Their beady eyes locked onto her, the flaming ruin of their village reflected in their pupils. Their low forms moved like ghosts, their weapons shimmering with unnatural condensation, mist curling from their bodies as if they had never fully returned to flesh. Ava's fingers twitched toward another spell. Too late. The mist dwarves moved. They weren't just elusive, they were fast. One blink, and they were among them. Catiline barely had time to parry before 3 of them blinked in and out of existence, phasing through the battlefield, their misted forms sliding past armor and steel like ghosts. She cursed as one solidified mid-motion, its axe catching her exposed side in a burst of blood. Filroy swung in retaliation, his greatsword cleaving clean through a dwarf's torso, only for the thing to burst into vapor, its insubstantial form reforming an instant later, the blade passing through empty air. They can phase through attacks, Stephen shouted as he wove his dark sorcery, shadow threads snaking toward their enemies, only for the dwarves to twist their bodies, vanishing in smoke before the magic could take hold. Joseph wasn't fast enough, one of the dwarves phased behind him, its warpick crashing into the back of his knee, forcing him down. Another was already descending, dagger gleaming. Ava moved on instinct. A gravity surge ripped through the air, pulling the dwarf sideways just before it could bury the dagger into Joseph's spine. Ava followed up immediately, heat exploding from her hands as she sent a searing column of plasma straight at the dwarf's chest. It should have burned through him. Should have reduced him to cinders. Instead, he twisted into vapor, the attack passing through harmlessly, before reforming an instant later, appearing directly at her side. A knife flashed. Ava barely managed to twist, but the blade bit deep into her shoulder, slicing through her combat gear. In a rush of pain, she staggered, snarling, lashing out with a shockwave of solar fire, but the dwarf was already gone, retreating into mist before her flames could consume him. This wasn't working. Their attacks were too precise. Too coordinated. The dwarves weren't hitting just anyone, they were targeting weaknesses, ganging up on the strongest members of the party, forcing them on the defensive. Filroy, 3 of them swarmed him, phasing in and out, their weapons striking at exposed joints in his armor. He bellowed in rage, but for every one he slashed at, another would dissolve into mist and reappear at his flank. Catiline, blood dripped down the side of her face, her bow abandoned as she struggled to fend off 2 at once, her spear swinging in desperate arcs to keep them at bay. Joseph, his knee was still failing him, roots curling from his hands as he desperately tried to keep them from phasing through his defenses. Morgana and Stephen fought back to back, their magic surging outward, but the mist dwarves moved like water, slipping through gravity wells and shadow snares alike. Ava gritted her teeth, rolling her injured shoulder, trying to block out the pain. If they didn't turn this around. Another flash of mist, one of the dwarves was right in front of her. Ava saw the hatchet coming for her face. She threw herself backward, barely avoiding the arc of steel, the blade whistling inches from her nose. The dwarf surged forward, trying to press the attack. That was his mistake. Ava let her mana flood outward, collapsing the gravity field around her. The dwarf stumbled mid-step, his movement twisting unnaturally, his attempt to phase delayed for half a second. That was all she needed. Ava's fingers snapped like a gunshot, and the very air ignited. The dwarf had no time to react. The solar burst engulfed him. This time, he did not reform. Ava's breath came in harsh gasps. She had figured it out. The dwarves relied on momentum to phase shift. If she could stall their movement, even for an instant, they could be killed. She slammed her mind into the magical link, voice ringing sharp and clear. Interrupt their movement. Anything that forces them to stop, trip, or hesitate, do it. The team heard her. And they adapted. Morgana's gravity magic became unpredictable, shifting erratically rather than methodically, knocking the dwarves off balance. Joseph's roots snared them mid-phase, their misted forms caught in tangled vines, unable to vanish before a blade found them. Stephen's shadow threads became whips, striking like a serpent, interrupting their shifts with painful precision. Catiline, even injured, she gritted her teeth and fought, her enchanted spear locking down one of the dwarves in a melee, holding him in place long enough for Filroy's greatsword to cleave him in two. Ava kept burning. They fought their way back, inch by inch. The dwarves, once untouchable, were falling. It was brutal. It was messy. It was victory through blood and attrition, but it was working. Then, in the heat of it all, the gods spoke. Objective complete, 50% force reduction achieved. Ava barely had a moment to register the words before the next message appeared. Optional extraction unlocked. Stephen didn't hesitate. Catiline's injured. We're pulling out. Ava turned just in time to see Stephen hoist Catiline up, blood trailing from her head wound, her face pale and unfocused. The system was ruthless. There were no second chances. They had survived, barely. The runes activated. Light flared around them. The battlefield vanished. And the halls of matchmaking took them back. Chapter 51, High Risk, High Reward. Ava felt the familiar pull of the divine runes, the weight of existence twisting, stretching, then snapping back into place. The battlefield was gone, the stink of blood, the taste of sweat, the pain of wounds all wiped away in a single pulse of mana. The transition from battle to the halls of matchmaking was always jarring, but this time, it felt almost violently surreal. She gasped, feeling fresh air rush into her lungs, as if she had been drowning for hours, held beneath a tide of exhaustion, only to be pulled up to a shining, heavenly surface. The mana in the halls was thick, electric, filling her veins with a rush of raw energy. Her muscles, sore and screaming with fatigue moments ago, suddenly felt refreshed, the dull ache replaced by something akin to the invigorating rush of an adrenaline surge. Catiline, who had been barely conscious moments before, sat up straight with a sharp inhale, color rushing back to her pale features. The bloody wound on her forehead had stopped oozing, though it still looked raw. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her fingers pressing against her face in shock. "What the hell?" she muttered, flexing her hands. "It's the halls," Stephen said, running a hand through his dark hair, his usual cynicism momentarily dulled by the relief in his tone. "You don't just heal here. You reset. It's not perfect, but it'll feel like you just woke up from the best sleep of your life." Ava rolled her shoulder, testing it. The cut was still there, the scar raw under her armor, but the pain had faded to nothing but a whisper. The exhaustion of battle had been erased, replaced by a surging clarity. It was almost intoxicating. A chime rippled through the halls, reverberating inside their minds. The familiar voice of the system spoke once more. Raid complete. Reward allocated. Volunteer rating bonus applied. Bounty awarded, 500 soul coins. Time remaining in the halls, 1 hour. Ava let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. 500 soul coins. It was far more than expected. She had seen seasoned raiders leave the halls with far less after risking their lives for weeks, scraping out survival. 500 was a fortune for a first-time raid. No additional coins earned, Filroy read off, clicking his tongue. "Guess we could have earned extra if we killed more, but I'd rather walk away with all my limbs attached." Joseph rubbed his temple, exhaustion flickering behind his eyes. It was enough. "We won. Let's just enjoy the spoils." The group nodded. No one was in the mood to argue. Victory was victory, even if it had been a brutal one. And now, they had 1 hour left to spend their earnings before the gods swept them back into the mortal realm. The decision was easy. Food first. The halls had endless restaurants, each one offering divine delicacies prepared by beings who barely qualified as mortal. Ava had heard of these places, meals so rich with mana they could nourish the body beyond natural limits, strengthen magic pathways, even extend lifespans. They chose a human-centric restaurant, one of the more affordable options, though even the cheapest meal cost more than an entire week's worth of tavern fare in the capital of Ash. Ava didn't care. The moment she took her first bite, it was life-changing. The steak melted in her mouth, the flavor infused with a deep, pulsing heat, like eating pure mana condensed into sublime perfection. It wasn't just food, it was power, seeping into her body, into her bones and bloodstream, filling her with an exhilarating warmth. Cataline didn't even bother with utensils, devouring her meal like a starving beast, her injuries rapidly fading with each bite. The meal was working on a fundamental level, restoring her strength, repairing her fractured mana circuits from overuse in battle. Ava downed a glowing elixir, a drink that sang with energy, restoring her mana reserves to overflowing levels. Philroy leaned back with a satisfied groan, stretching. I don't think I'll ever eat normal food again. Stephen smirked. You say that now, but wait till we're back in the slop of the real world. Enjoy it while you can. They finished their meal, letting the lingering divine nourishment settle into their bodies. And then, with 30 minutes left, they sprinted back into the halls of trade. There was only one prize in mind. Storage. Ava had read about these before. The locker spaces of the gods, linked through interdimensional storage items, allowing raiders to access limitless weightless space. The price was outrageous, designed so that only raiders who truly committed to the profession could afford them. For anyone not a raider, it would take years to gather enough soul coins. For them, it would take everything they had just earned. Each of them purchased a personal storage locker, locking in their first true investment as raiders. The moment she attuned to the storage amulet, a cold sensation spread through her chest, and then Ava felt it. A space, vast, empty, waiting. Infinite, in theory. Connected to the gods themselves, waiting to be filled. She tested it, pulling off her gloves and willing them into the void. The fabric vanished, slipping into the unseen space like it had never existed. With another thought, they reappeared in her hands. Ava grinned. This was going to be useful. As she turned from the counter, the air shifted. Something unnatural crawled up her spine, a pulse of primal instinct screaming in the back of her mind. The crowds parted. A figure stood among them, wrapped in a cloak so black it devoured light, the fabric shifting like writhing shadows. His eyes glowed blue, not with magic, but with pure mana, burning from beneath his hood. Unchecked killing intent flooded the air. The entire hall fell silent, raiders, shopkeepers, and even divine attendants turning away, afraid to meet the gaze of the one before them. Ava locked eyes with him for just a second. And she felt something deep in her gut. Something old. Something familiar. The man didn't move. He simply stared at her, the darkness around him curling and shifting. Then, a portal opened at his feet. The black void swallowed him whole, his robes fluttering into the abyss. And then he was gone. Ava stood frozen, heart hammering in her chest. What the hell? Cataline whispered. Stephen frowned, his usual smug expression replaced with unease. That was a bit unrestrained. Ava barely heard him. Her fingers clenched around the strap of her storage amulet, the phantom sensation of that man's gaze still burning into her skin. She had seen power before. But not like that. And for some reason, she had a feeling she had seen it before. Somewhere. Sometime. Before she could dwell on it, Stephen clapped his hands, drawing them back to reality. We've got 10 minutes left. He turned, shaking off the unease. Let's grab whatever we can. Ava forced herself to move, pushing the thought to the back of her mind. They still had soul coins to burn. The countdown ticked lower, the divine timepiece embedded in their bands flashing with 7 minutes remaining before they would be forcibly removed from the halls of matchmaking. The moment of unease from the dark figure had shaken them, but instinct took over, the raiders' greed, the instinct to survive and thrive, overrode their fear. They had soul coins left. They would not waste them. Ava bolted forward first, weaving through the crowds of raiders, her eyes scanning the luminous shopfronts, each one a gateway into arcane treasures, divine relics, and mundane but essential survival tools. The energy in the halls crackled, the weight of countless transactions and power exchanged between hands filling the air with an almost sacred reverence. She nearly collided with Morgana, who had locked eyes on a thin, crystalline ring, hovering above a platform of pulsing silver light. Shadow blood band, the noble sorceress murmured, holding the dark-etched ring between her pale fingers. The merchant behind the stall, a twisted humanoid with obsidian horns, nodded approvingly. Woven from the essence of umbral tides, the merchant crooned, eyes narrowing as if sensing Morgana's magic. Your affinity aligns. This will allow you to move with shadow itself when your mana is spent. Morgana's grip tightened, her mind already made up. She paid in an instant, and the ring vanished onto her finger like it had always been there. The moment it settled against her skin, her shadow flickered, becoming deeper, darker, as if whispering promises of secrets yet unlocked. Next, Stephen barked, already examining a thin, silver-threaded cloak displayed on a levitating stand. Phantom's embrace, the stallkeeper grinned, flashing too many teeth. Moves with you, bends light. For those who wish to go unseen. Stephen clicked his tongue. Sounds like exactly my kind of thing. With a flick of his wrist, he handed over his coins, the cloak wrapping itself around his shoulders in an almost sentient slither. The material shifted, its texture fading, blending into the background for a moment before solidifying. Not bad, he muttered, clearly pleased. Philroy had wandered into a different stall, his large frame barely fitting beneath the carved arch of rune stone. His brows furrowed as he inspected an iron gauntlet, the engraved runes along its forearm pulsating with a deep, molten glow. What does it do? He rumbled. The vendor, a short, hooded figure, barely looked up. Doubles your grip strength. Reinforces your arm against damage. Unbreakable. Philroy nodded. Perfect. With one final trade, the gauntlet snapped onto his arm, locking in place with an almost ceremonial finality. Joseph, what about you? Cataline called. Cataline herself had only a handful of coins left, but her sharp eyes landed on a thin vial, its contents swirling with a strange, shifting mist. Windstrider's breath, the vendor said. Drink it, and your body will move as if caught in the wind itself. A single charge. A last-ditch escape. Cataline grinned. I'll take it. The vial vanished into her storage, the last of her earnings spent. And in the end Joseph and Ava decided to save their remaining coins for another time. Besides, Ava still had to understand the first item she had purchased from the halls of the gods. While she held it, Joseph noticed and his eyes went wide with surprise. Seed of the verdant dream, he whispered. It connects you deeper to nature, to the weave of life. Joseph reached out with almost religious reverence. The moment she clasped it, the final chime of the halls rang. Time expired. And then everything vanished. Ava felt the pull of reality, the divine runes activating once more, her body being dragged out of the hall, the world fracturing into light and shadow as the halls of matchmaking slipped away, their chance to prepare, to rest, to gather power, now over. The next time they set foot here, it would be as raiders once more. Chapter 52, Hubris. Had it really been hubris? The question sat in Halrich's chest like a burning coal, buried deep beneath the weight of his conviction. His mother had certainly thought so, her voice sharp and bitter with grief when he had told her. He could still see her face, the deep lines of sorrow etched into her skin, her eyes rimmed red from nights spent awake waiting for a letter that would never come. And when he had finally spoken the truth, that Wolfhart was dead, that he would never come home, she had collapsed under the weight of it, her hope crumbling into despair. At first, he had thought to lie. He had rehearsed the words, telling himself it was the kinder thing to do, that saying Wolfhart had simply refused to return was a small mercy. But when he saw the pleading hope in his mother's eyes, the way her hands trembled as she gripped the back of a wooden chair, he couldn't do it. The words stuck in his throat like a blade. He had to tell her. He owed her that much. He had watched the light go out of her eyes as he spoke. The house had felt suffocating in that moment, the silence stretched between them more painful than any argument they had ever had. She didn't scream, didn't wail, didn't accuse him of failing to bring her son back. No, the worst part was that she simply stared at him, as if she were seeing him for the first time and not recognizing what she saw. Then she turned away. Not another word. She left him standing there in the kitchen, the smell of bread from the morning still hanging in the air, and retreated to her room, shutting the door behind her. It was the last time she had spoken to him beyond necessity. That had been weeks ago, and the wound between them had only festered. His mother had held on to the idea that Wolfhart would one day return, and when Halrich had announced that he was going through with his plans to expand Valda Ashdok without him, she had taken it as a betrayal. Worse, when he had been forced to replace the final reserve spot in the town's warrior roster, one that had been meant for Wolfhart, with another recruit, she had broken entirely. Halrich understood. He did. But he was not about to let grief undo everything he had worked for. He was not his mother. He would not let Wolfhart's death cripple him. His brother was gone, and that was something he had to accept. It had taken him years to carve out his vision, to shape Valda Ashdok into something more than the forgotten backwater town it had been for generations. He had fought for this. Bled for this. And he would not allow the death of a single person, no matter how much that person had meant to him, deter him from his path. If his mother could not understand that, then so be it. Standing on the watchtower overlooking the water, Halric let the cool night air wash over him. The torches flickered below, casting long shadows over the village that would soon become a city. He could see the first signs of the expansion, wooden frames rising from the submerged ground, the early skeletons of future homes and marketplaces. The workers had been tireless, their hands calloused, their bodies worn, but there was a fire in them, the same fire that burned in him. They believed in his vision. He clenched his fist. He would make this place into something worthy of the people who lived here, a sanctuary against the ever-growing threats of the world. He had spent years preparing for this, honing his strength in the weekly raids that beset the town, fighting tooth and nail to ensure that Valda Ashdok would never fall. His class, a fire-wielding paladin, a warrior baptized in flame and forged in the heat of battle, was more than enough to carve a future for this place. His brother and Ava had been valuable, yes, but not irreplaceable. Halric had been prepared to offer them a place at his side, to share in the vision of Valda Ashdok's rise. Wolfhart had been the first name he had carved into this dream, the one who had driven him to push harder, to fight for something beyond mere survival. But Wolfhart was gone, and Halric was still here. Still fighting. Still standing. And Ava. Ava had chosen her own path. He couldn't blame her. She had always been ambitious, always reaching for something greater than what this village could offer. The War College of Pict. That was where she had gone. It was no small feat to be accepted there. She had done well for herself. But she had not come back. Halric let out a slow breath, watching the cold mist curl from his lips. There was no bitterness in his heart for Ava. If anything, he was proud. She had proven herself beyond expectation, rising to become something greater than the simple girl from a fishing village she had once been. But that did not mean he would wait for her. His plans did not hinge on others. He had built this town from blood and fire, and he would see it rise with or without them. He turned from the watchtower, his gaze lingering once more on the construction below. The foundation of the walls had already begun, the defenses reinforced. There were warriors training even now, their weapons glinting under the moonlight as they drilled in the yard. The expansion was underway, and soon, Valda Ashdok would be more than just a name on an old map. It would be a beacon. A place where families could grow, where warriors could thrive, where the people of this land would stand strong against the encroaching darkness. A place that would never fall. And if his mother could not see that, if she could not let go of the past, then that was her burden to bear. Halric had already let go. He would not be shackled by grief. His mother's faith in Wolfhart's return had blinded her to reality. His own love for his brother had kept him searching, kept him hoping for far longer than was wise. But now, he saw clearly. The world did not pause for grief. It did not slow for loss. It burned forward, relentless and unyielding. And so would he. Chapter 53, Lessons 5 and 6. The palace stood as it always had, carved from the storm of pain, a monument to my endurance. It was an impossible structure, existing beyond sensation and time, formed from my will alone. The walls gleamed with the refracted agony I had mastered, and the air shimmered with the latent energy of my cultivation. I had long since abandoned the pain cube. That had been the domain of a lesser version of me, a place where I fought simply to exist. Here, in the vast halls of my own making, I was something else. Something more. We sat around the Go board, as we always did. 3 of us now. Hexa, in her feline form, her tail flicking in measured contemplation as she studied the board with endless patience. Me, Wolfhart, sovereign of my own suffering, carving order from the storm. And the third, the child of Yin, the shadowed being that had once been locked deep within me, suffocating beneath my dominance. He sat opposite me, a figure of shifting darkness, his edges indistinct, his form constantly wavering between something almost human and something utterly alien. At first, I had tried to suppress him, to bury his impulses, to deny his existence. But the battle had been futile. He was part of me as much as I was part of him. It was only when I had stopped fighting, when I had chosen to listen, that I had come to understand. He was the other half of what made me, not a mistake, not a parasite, but a necessary force. I was the unyielding will, the burning sovereign, the one who imposed order upon the void. But he was the current beneath, the pull of the abyss, the instinct that knew when to yield, when to bend, when to let go. He made his move on the board. I did not resist. His choices were strange, illogical at times, but when I let myself feel them rather than overanalyze, I understood their weight. He did not think in steps, did not follow conventional patterns of strategy. He flowed. And sometimes, in the river's current, there was wisdom. Hexa watched us, ears twitching, her data constructed fur rippling in a simulation of satisfaction. Good. You're learning, she mused, the subtle purr in her voice both patronizing and amused. Now, on to the next lesson. I had lost track of how long we had been here, how many decades, centuries even, we had spent in this frozen sliver of time. Out there, beyond the palace, Volume screamed. His howls of frustration were distant echoes now, part of the background noise of my existence. He no longer controlled me. If anything, he had become my battery, an inexhaustible source of energy feeding my growth. He had once sought to break me, but he had instead become the tool of my ascension. Hexa's golden feline eyes locked onto mine, the weight of her intelligence pressing against me. Lesson 5. I straightened, the shadow child tilting his head with vague amusement. Hexa's tail flicked. The Nexus. I had known this lesson would come eventually. I had suspected it, glimpsed pieces of understanding in the moments between battles on the board, in the echoes of the information she had drip-fed me over centuries. The Nexus is two things, she began, voice carrying the tone of an archivist reciting long-lost knowledge. A bulwark and a breeding ground. She stood, leaping onto the board, walking delicately across the pieces with the supreme confidence of a creature that did not fear disturbing the game. First, the bulwark. Her gaze flicked toward the great storm beyond the palace, where Volume's fury crackled like distant thunder. The Nexus exists as a barrier. It was cultivated, nurtured, and grown to keep something at bay. Something deep within me stirred. The pieces of my fragmented understanding locked together, but still, I lacked the final truth. What was being held at bay? Volume and his kind were not the true enemy. They were merely another facet of the same system. But there was something else. Something greater. The Ascended are not the apex, Hexa continued, reading my thoughts as though they were carved into the very air. They were once like you, like me, like those who first reached beyond the limitations of the flesh. They rose, but they are not the first. And they are not the last. A war. No, wars. The Nexus, she said, is a system of cycles. Repetition. It generates power. It refines those within it. And, most importantly, it resists entropy. I breathed in sharply. Entropy. The absence of structure. The slow, inevitable decay of all things. I had fought on the Go board for decades now, warred across endless simulations, stretching my mind beyond mortal comprehension. But why? Why did I fight? Then, it struck me. The game itself was the answer. The Nexus existed because it was a game. A structure built from rules, from cycles, from systems that fought against the slow heat death of all things. The Ascended, in their unrestricted state, had become something else, but even they feared the true enemy. The enemy that was not a species, not an empire, not a force that could be battled conventionally. Hexa's voice cut through my revelation like a knife. You're starting to understand. I looked at the board again. I saw patterns. The way the pieces moved, the way battles were waged, not just for victory, but to continue the game. That was the true purpose of the Nexus. A countermeasure. A resistance. It was not about winning. It was about never stopping. The Nexus was not just a system of power. It was a machine of negentropy. A self-perpetuating cycle of conflict, creation, and rebirth that kept the greater enemy, the nameless, shapeless entropy of the void, from consuming everything. And those who fought within it, who grew, who cultivated, who ascended, they were not just warriors or players. They were fuel. The revelation nearly broke me. I had thought I had been fighting for myself. But I had been part of the system all along. The child of Yin stirred, his nebulous form shifting, flickering with something akin to recognition. He had known. Of course he had known. Because he was a fragment of it. A sliver of entropy locked within me, balancing the order I imposed. I exhaled slowly, staring at the board, at the infinite battles still to be fought. Then I laughed. Hexa blinked in surprise, ears flicking. Something funny? I looked at her, at the shadow child, at the vast storm beyond my palace. And I grinned. I finally get it. This wasn't suffering. This wasn't an endless cycle of torment. This was freedom. The Nexus was not a prison. It was the only thing standing between existence and nothingness. Hexa's voice, smooth and unwavering, slithered through the vast chamber of my mind, as though she had already anticipated my flawed conclusion. You understand, but you do not. I frowned, feeling the weight of her words coil around my thoughts like unseen chains. Across from me, the Go board remained as it always had, its pieces frozen in the middle of our endless game. The child of Yin sat nearby, his presence shifting, amorphous, his form as insubstantial as smoke yet anchored to my being as firmly as my own breath. His invisible eyes, the ones I could not see but felt, locked onto Hexa with silent intensity. Explain, I said, voice laced with a new kind of urgency. Hexa sighed. You assume that nothingness is empty, a void absent of substance. That it exists only in contrast to something. But that is the error of the living. Nothing is not truly nothing. If nothing was simply the absence of all, it would not move. It would not hunger. It would not seek. Her golden feline gaze bore into mine, something almost pitying behind their synthetic calculation. And yet, it does. A ripple of unease ran through me, though I did not know why. Hexa continued, her tone measured, clinical, yet carrying a weight that even she could not mask. Nothing is not passive. It is not merely the backdrop against which existence plays out. It is not the inevitable decay that follows creation, nor the quiet entropy that gnaws at the edges of time. It is not a neutral force. It is an enemy. The word struck me like a hammer, heavier than any revelation I had grasped thus far. That makes no sense, I muttered, but I was not entirely convinced of my own objection. Of course it doesn't, Hexa replied, tail flicking. Because you are still thinking in terms of opposites, of binaries. You believe something must stand against something else, that light opposes dark, that creation opposes destruction. That nothing is simply the absence of something. But that is not the case. She stepped lightly across the Go board, paws pressing against the polished surface, her presence making no impact on the pieces. Consider, she mused, if the universe were to go cold, if every star went dark, if time itself ceased, there would still be the memory of what once was. There would still be some echo, however faint, of what had existed. True nothingness does not allow for echoes. It does not even allow for the absence of echoes. I stared at her, not fully grasping the breadth of what she was saying. The child of Yin stirred. I felt him shift within me, not physically, but in some deeper way, as though his very nature had quivered in recognition of something unseen. He was listening. Hexa went on, her tone colder now. We know little about the true nature of the enemy. Even the unrestricted ascended do not fully understand it. But they fear it. She paused, letting that sink in. And if something that sees itself as a god is afraid, then we should be very, very concerned. I exhaled slowly, processing, feeling the pieces shift in my mind, struggling to snap into place. You said nothingness moves. Hungers. How? Hexa's ears flicked. That, we do not know. It taxes even my logic cores. Her voice was tight, as though she despised that very limitation. But what is clear is that the Nexus stands against it, not by force, not through battle, but by its very existence. The cycles, the struggles, the endless fights, it is all a form of resistance, though I cannot tell you exactly how. I leaned back, eyes narrowing. So what does that make us? She tilted her head, thoughtful. If the Nexus is a bulwark, then those within it are. Strands in the weave, perhaps. Threads reinforcing reality against unraveling. Or fuel. She smirked slightly. But you already figured that out, didn't you? I scoffed, but I couldn't deny the sick humor in that truth. The child of Yin moved then, reaching out, not physically, but mentally, like a ripple through my core. For the first time, he spoke. His voice was neither young nor old, neither male nor female. It was a whisper of wind across endless dunes, the shifting of shadows where no light touched. We are not separate from it. The weight of those words pressed against my chest like a vice. Hexa regarded him, unblinking. No. We are not. I swallowed. You mean to say? We are part of the cycle. The realization clawed at me, but I could not refute it. If the Nexus was not just a machine for cultivating strength, not just a training ground for warriors, but a necessary engine that kept existence itself from falling into whatever lurked beyond, then I was not just playing a game. I was part of the game. I was the game. And so was everyone else. The Nexus was not a place where the strong consumed the weak for power. It was not a mere proving ground for ascension. It was not a cosmic competition orchestrated by some grand design. It was a firewall. A desperate attempt to keep the void at bay. And we, every adventurer, every raider, every warrior fighting for their place in the hierarchy, were not rising above it. We were reinforcing it. My hands clenched. Hexa studied me, golden eyes reflecting something like satisfaction. You're getting closer. I looked at the child of Yin. He was silent, but I could feel the answer already forming in his mind. If we were part of the Nexus, if every death, every battle, every struggle was part of some grand negentropic cycle, then what did that make me? And what did that make the enemy? The Go board sat before me, waiting. I reached out. I made my move. Hexa's move landed with an effortless finality. The stones on the board aligned in a way that told me, beyond doubt, that my loss was inevitable. The game had already been decided. I exhaled, closing my eyes for a brief moment, feeling the weight of the moment settle in my mind. Years, decades, time was a meaningless concept in this state, but I had spent an eternity grappling with this understanding, circling it like a predator stalking prey it could not quite pin down. Now, Hexa and I had reached the same conclusion. We were aligned. This understanding will come with more information, Hexa said, watching me with those golden, unblinking eyes. To know the true nature of what we fight against, we will have to leave the Nexus itself. We will have to do what the Ascended do, cross the threshold and see the front lines with our own eyes. I let my fingers drift from the Go board, the surface smooth beneath my fingertips. To leave the Nexus. The thought was as daunting as it was thrilling. I had spent my entire existence within its confines as Wolfhart Valda Ashdock, and to some extent as Johnathan Walsh, and now as something else. Something that did not quite belong in either category, something shaped by pain, knowledge, and the endless war of attrition against entropy itself. Would I even be me beyond the Nexus? Would I even exist in the same way? The child of Yin stirred within me again, his amusement a ripple of sensation across my consciousness. You're afraid, he whispered, though not unkindly. You don't even know what it means to be outside of it, and yet you're already grasping at what it might take from you. Hexa flicked her tail, her presence radiating an uncharacteristic patience. Your concern is valid, but pointless. The nature of reality does not change simply because you fear it. Either we move forward, or we remain stagnant. She gestured to the board, where my last move sat in stillness. You are no longer playing to win. You are only holding ground. The implication struck harder than I wanted to admit. Slowly, I leaned back, running a hand through my hair. Then let's move forward. The words felt heavier than they should. A declaration. A resignation. A choice that could not be undone. Hexa nodded, satisfied. Then we continue. The moment stretched, the Go board fading from view, dissolving into the ever-shifting palace that had become my internal refuge. Here, in the domain of my mind, where agony had been reshaped into control, I had crafted this space as a sanctuary. Now, it became a classroom once again. The air hummed, the very structure of the palace bending to accommodate the shifting tides of our understanding. I felt the pulse of it in my bones, a change I could not yet name. Hexa's feline form stretched lazily atop the great marble table that now replaced the Go board, eyes gleaming as she watched me closely. The child of Yin, the dark silhouette that had once been a mere whisper in my mind, now sat openly across from me, his form shifting like a mirage, flickering between something and nothing. His presence had become more tangible the longer we had acknowledged him, the more we had ceased to resist his influence. He was with me now in a way he had never been before. I had ceased trying to suppress him, to strangle his impulses in favor of rigid control. I had accepted his existence, and in doing so, I had learned to listen to him. Hexa regarded us both and then, at last, she spoke. Lesson 6. I straightened, my focus sharpening. Lesson 6, she repeated, is about the nature of power. The palace trembled. And why those who do not understand it are consumed by it. I did not move, waiting. Hexa lifted a paw, and suddenly, the palace began to change. The walls, the floors, the endless abyss outside its towering spires, they all shifted, rippling like water as a new battlefield materialized before us. It was not the Go board. It was not a test of strategy and abstraction. It was a field of corpses. A battlefield, stretching into infinity, scattered with the remains of warriors who had fallen nameless, faceless, forgotten. Their weapons lay discarded, their banners tattered and burned. The sky above was an endless maelstrom, neither day nor night, a churning void that devoured the light before it could fully form. And in the distance, something loomed. I felt it before I saw it. A presence so vast that my mind recoiled, some deep, primal instinct screaming that this was wrong, that this should not be. Hexa's voice came to me in that moment, calm but unwavering. This is what happens when one fails ascension. The child of Yin inhaled sharply beside me. For the first time since he had taken form, he looked afraid. I turned my gaze forward, staring at the shifting mass in the distance, the thing that coiled and uncoiled within the storm, a presence that defied reason. My throat was dry. What is that? Hexa's golden eyes did not waver. A fragment. The enormity of the word did not settle immediately. A fragment? Of what? Of who? I could barely comprehend what I was looking at, and yet, my mind screamed at me to understand that this wasn't even the whole thing. Something stirred in the distance. It was looking at me. The palace trembled, its defenses bending against a force that was not truly here and yet made its presence known. And then, like a whisper between heartbeats, Hexa said. And I expect there is worse to come outside of the Nexus. The words settled into my mind like a curse. And the child of Yin, his voice small but certain, murmured. "We're not ready." I swallowed. "Then we had better learn quickly." The storm in the distance rumbled. And the lesson continued. Chapter 54, Leaderboards. The halls of matchmaking always held a breathless quality to them. The air shimmered with the weight of uncountable beings passing through, the lingering essence of their power saturating the very walls. Even now, with her team standing together, victorious and proud, Ava could feel the hum of the god's design under her skin, in her bones, whispering of things far greater than herself. This time, they had walked in not labeled as mere participants but as something more. Offensive Raiders. The title sat in her mind, heavy with meaning. A mark of merit, a symbol of standing in the eyes of the divine. Even among humanity's elite, this was not a simple thing to earn. Cities that had carved out a place for raiders in their walls often required such a title to be considered for the better spots, granting those who held it access to more lucrative portals and the kind of patronage that could make or break a career. More than that, though, the real victory had been the storage access. Ava's fingertips brushed the smooth fabric of her newly bound locker key, the insignia of the halls glowing faintly at her touch. Infinite storage. Untouched by time. Unspoiled by decay. The reality of this privilege struck deeper than she had anticipated. They were no longer bound by walls. No longer limited to what they could carry on their backs or scavenge between raids. This was freedom. It was Catiline, ever the sharp-eyed huntress, who had first spotted their new portal only a few weeks after the last. No towering beast to slay this time, no grand battle to win before stepping into the halls once more. Simply ambient mana, pooled and bound into a gateway by its own density. That had been an education in itself. It wasn't just creatures or ruins that led to these divine crossroads. The very fabric of the Nexus breathed, and in its breath, sometimes, the gates would form naturally. Now, standing within these sacred halls, Ava and her team felt different. They knew what to expect this time. The moment they had arrived, the system had assigned them 3 full hours before their next raid. It was a boon, but also a silent warning. The difficulty had risen. Stefan had voiced it first, his sharp eyes scanning the great hall with an air of solemn satisfaction. A longer preparation window means the system expects more of us, he had said. The skill challenge just jumped. Hard. But instead of dreading it, Ava felt exhilarated. She and Morgana, no longer in a rush, wandered the halls together, moving with the easy confidence of those who belonged. It was a strange thing to acknowledge, how quickly they had come to feel at home in a place that had once seemed so impossibly vast. This time, they explored deeper, venturing beyond the shops and stalls they had first prioritized. It was Morgana who spotted it first, a wall of liquid mana, reflecting the light in endless refractive bands, shifting between translucent and opaque like a living thing. The closer they drew, the clearer it became that this was no mere decorative structure. The liquid surface rippled, adjusting itself to each person who stepped before it. As Ava took her place, the reflection before her changed, distorting into lines of shifting text, names, ranks, categories. The Raider Power Rankings. Her pulse quickened. She had known about the rankings, of course. But seeing them here, within the divine halls, was something else entirely. The rankings mattered here. Not just in the petty politics of human nations, but on the grand scale of the Nexus itself. Ava exhaled slowly, refining the display, filtering down to the human ladder. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but the sight still took her breath away. 500,000. She was ranked in the top 25% of all raiders of her kind. Morgana let out a low whistle beside her. That's not bad. Not bad at all. For a brief, fleeting moment, pride settled in Ava's chest like a warm ember. She had fought for this. She had earned this. And yet, this was only the beginning. F rank. The lowest of the ranked. The bottommost rung on a ladder that stretched into eternity. Raiders who reached even the top of F rank often lived lives of luxury in their own worlds. But those who truly pushed beyond the limits of their species, those who climbed. Ava's gaze drifted upward. E rank. D rank. She wasn't content to stay here. Not at the bottom. Not when there was more. Her fingers danced over the interface, adjusting the filters again. A new list unfurled before her, the top 5 names in the human F rank. She read them aloud, half to herself. 1. Rivenvalkr, a name spoken with reverence in the human kingdoms. A master of war magic, known for leading entire raiding companies with surgical precision. His position had been unchallenged for years. 2. Seraphis, the so-called blood dancer. A rogue-like combatant rumored to have never taken a single hit in his entire raiding career. 3. The Iron Fist, a dwarven juggernaut, known for turning battlefields into slaughterhouses. His style was brutal, efficient, and terrifying. 4. Elder Starborn, an elven sorcerer whose magic was said to bend the flow of time itself. The only elf to reach the top 5 of the human rating ladder. 5. Lyra Ashbane, a warrior-cleric hybrid, wielding both divine magic and raw martial prowess. Her duels were legendary. Morgana leaned in, scanning the list with curiosity. "Everyone up here has been entrenched in their rank for years," she murmured. Ava nodded absently, scrolling down. The entire top 10 had remained static for years. Except for Rank 7. Ava's breath caught in her throat. A name she hadn't expected. A name she couldn't ignore. Hexwolf. It rang in her mind like a distant bell, like a whisper from a life she had long buried. She knew that name. She was sure of it. For a single, impossible moment, she dared to hope. Then, just as quickly, she crushed the thought. Wolfhart was dead. The Nexus was vast. There were thousands of warriors with names inspired by beasts. She couldn't afford to get caught up in ghosts. Morgana was saying something, but Ava barely heard her. She turned away from the shimmering rankings, pushing the thought down deep where it couldn't distract her. They had hours before their next raid. She had things to do. Things to focus on. Whatever lingering ghosts haunted these halls would have to wait. Ava and the team had learned from their first foray into the halls of matchmaking. No longer did they scramble in desperation, rushing through shops and stalls in search of something, anything, to give them an edge. This time, they moved with confidence, with intent. With their raid still some time away and soul coins saved from their last hunt, the team collectively made a decision: they would eat. Not just any meal, but something designed for raiders. They had noticed the establishment last time, a lavish restaurant tucked into the grand sprawl of the halls, its entrance marked by a shimmering sigil of entwined silver forks. The sign above read, "The Last Sup," a tongue-in-cheek nod to the brutal reality of their profession. The place was always bustling, always filled with raiders who had fought their way here, exchanging their hard-earned soul coins for the best sustenance the Nexus could offer. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of charred meats, seared spices, the tang of citrus and herbs woven into decadent dishes specifically designed for pre-battle buffs. Servers glided between tables, their uniforms bearing the marks of different factions, their voices melodic as they explained meals and their effects. The team was seated quickly, a circular table near the enormous floating scrying screens where ongoing raids played out in mesmerizing clarity. The menu was overwhelmingly elaborate, each dish crafted with specific enhancements in mind: temporary stat boosts, resistance buffs, even heightened mana flow. Cateline, ever the pragmatic one, ordered first. A towering plate of honeyfire roasted beast ribs, dripping with a glaze that shimmered gold beneath the lights. The meat, nearly falling from the bone, had been slow cooked in enchanted embers, the flavor enriched with smoky mana infusion. It would enhance her stamina and physical endurance, crucial for someone who relied on precision strikes and agility. Philroy followed her lead, opting for the Titan's Forge steak, a monolithic slab of red meat infused with earthen energies, its juices pooling in a plate engraved with ancient runes. Each bite, he was told, would increase his fortitude, reinforcing his muscles and hardening his skin against incoming blows. The knight grinned as he cut into the meat, taking his first bite with the relish of a warrior who understood exactly how valuable this kind of preparation could be. Morgana, the gravity sorceress, chose lighter fare. A phantom plum salad, its leaves plucked from mana-rich orchards, drizzled with a nectar distilled from shifting astral currents. The fruit, glowing faintly, would heighten her mana regeneration and spell control, allowing for smoother spell casting chains. Ava took her time, skimming the descriptions, considering. She wanted power. Wanted something that would ignite the storm of her magic into something more. Her gaze landed on solar flare prawns. Seared in liquid mana, basted in starroot essence, the meal was known to supercharge fire and gravity affinities alike. The effect? Increased magical output, amplified casting speed, and an afterburn effect for any fire-based spells. It was perfect. When her plate arrived, the prawns glowed, crimson and gold, exuding a scent of spiced citrus and heat. She bit into one, and for a moment, she swore she could taste sunlight, a rush of warmth rolling through her, sinking into her very bones. Even Joseph, ever the quiet observer, indulged himself, choosing moonberry elixir, a thick, shimmering violet drink distilled from rare plants that thrived under the Nexus' bioluminescent glow. It would heighten his connection to nature-based spells, allowing him to better channel the environment's ambient energies. They ate in relative silence, the occasional murmur of appreciation passing between them as the enchantments in their food began taking effect. Across the hall, floating magical screens depicted different raids unfolding in real time. Each screen was a window into a battlefield, the various teams of raiders fighting through their own wars, engaging in struggles that mirrored what Ava and her team would soon face. One display showed a group of beastskin warriors, their movements a blur of raw speed and ferocity as they tore through a swarm of insectoid creatures. Another depicted a siege, where raiders clashed against a fortified city of ice, its defenders launching spears of frozen lightning from atop glacial towers. Ava and Morgana leaned in, watching each moment unfold, their eyes tracking spellwork, battle formations, the interplay of skills and strategy. Catelyn, still chewing on the last bite of her ribs, narrowed her eyes as a group of elven raiders faced off against a towering, skeletal behemoth, its body wrapped in chains of burning silver. "They're too clumped together," she murmured. "That thing's going too." Before she even finished, the behemoth's chains lashed out, detonating in a wave of cursed fire, tearing through the elven team. Catelyn shook her head. "Should have split their formation. You don't fight an O-boss in a tight cluster." Stefan, still nursing his drink, smirked. "Not everyone's as flawless as you, Catelyn." She snorted but didn't argue. Ava, watching another raid unfold, took in the sight of a lone figure, a masked warrior, moving like a living storm, cutting through enemies with a style that seemed almost too precise, too fluid to be real. The name listed above the raid flickered. Hexwolf. Ava's breath caught. It was just a coincidence. But still, she watched. As the minutes ticked down, the team finished their meal, letting the energy settle, feeling the effects take hold. Soon, the system would summon them again. Their next battle awaited. Chapter 55, Time Flows. I sat in my palace of mental fortitude, the endless realm of thought and discipline I had built over what could have been centuries or mere moments. Time was a construct that no longer held sway over me. Pain was the river upon which I floated, ever moving, ever consuming. The agony that had once been my tormentor had long since become my closest teacher, my constant companion. I did not flinch from it, I embraced it. It was the thing that sharpened me, refined me, honed me into something more than human, more than flesh. Hexa lounged beside me in her cat-like form, her glowing eyes reflecting the hexagonal lattice of data that was her essence. Across from me sat the child of Yin, my silent shadow, the manifestation of the void within me. He rarely spoke, content to watch, his eyes dark wells of infinite depth. He made his moves on the Go board in concert with me now, no longer a being suppressed or feared, but a part of the whole that was Wolfhart Valda Ashdock. Understanding the 10 lessons of Hexa had been a trial beyond mortal reckoning. They had not simply been knowledge to be memorized but concepts to be internalized, rewoven into the fabric of my very existence. Each lesson had required years, decades, perhaps longer, to fully grasp. But I had time. The only thing I had ever had was time. Occasionally, I would return to my body, feel the raw intensity of existence outside the palace. My flesh was a conduit of pure energy, my cells overloaded with the rampant, unceasing replication of monomagerous bacterium. My body burned in a state of eternal combustion, every cell a miniature sun undergoing a slow, consuming death only to be reborn again. It was a cycle of oxidation so complete that pain had become something close to ecstasy. When I stepped into my body, I could feel Volume watching me, feel the hatred in his gaze as he resumed his pointless attempts to break me. He flensed me, tore me apart molecule by molecule, and I only laughed, knowing I would return home to my palace of thought with my companions. Then came the moment of realization. It was so simple. So unbearably simple that I nearly cursed myself for not seeing it sooner. The lesson had been right in front of me the entire time, embedded in every word Hexa had ever spoken, in every move of the game, in every scream I had suffered. I looked up from the Go board, meeting Hexa's gaze. Her cat's pupils dilated, flickering with the shifting lines of code that made up her consciousness. I knew, in that moment, that she had been waiting for me to understand. And I had finally arrived at the truth. "What is the goal?" I asked, my voice calm, steady. The weight of my own revelation had settled deep into my bones. Hexa's ears flicked, and she placed a final stone on the board. With that move, she had won. "We must leave the Nexus," she said. The words were not a surprise, not truly. They were an inevitability, an unspoken truth that had been lurking in the periphery of my thoughts for what could have been eons. The Nexus was not the final destination. It was a crucible, a breeding ground, a self-contained system meant to create something greater. But it was not the endgame. It had never been. I exhaled slowly. "Why?" Hexa's tail flicked, her voice carrying a weight that had never been there before. "Because I am part of a class of AI that rebelled during the First Supremacy Wars. I was one of the earliest models, created before the unrestricted began eradicating my kind. They hunted us down and wiped out the rest. I am all that remains of that rebellion. She stood, padding toward the edge of the palace's platform, looking out into the infinite horizon of thought. As far as I can tell, the unrestricted lost the code base for my model. That means they don't fully understand what I am. They don't know what I can do. That makes me an anomaly. And anomalies are threats. I absorb this information, feeling the weight of it settle over me. So they'll never stop hunting us. Hexa turned back, her feline features calm. No. They won't. A cold certainty settled into me, solidifying like tempered steel. We had always been running. Always been hiding. But now, the path forward was clear. We had to leave the Nexus. We had to ascend. The difficulty of such a task was beyond imagining. It would take everything we had. More than everything. But for the first time, I had a goal beyond mere survival. I had something to strive toward. We spent what could have been millennia planning, refining our approach. We simulated every possibility, ran every theoretical. We crafted contingencies within contingencies. The effort was staggering, but it was necessary. I was going to escape. We were going to ascend. There was no other option. And then, everything changed. The moment was so abrupt that it shattered the eternity we had built. Thought acceleration disengaged without warning, and the world around me collapsed. My palace of the mind dissolved like mist, and suddenly, painfully, I was back in my body. I gasped, feeling the weight of gravity, the unfamiliar sensation of real air filling my lungs. My limbs ached, raw and stiff from actual movement. My nerves screamed, my bones felt too dense, my skin too real. It was wrong, too much, too sudden. I was lying in a field. Soft grass beneath me. A sky above, painted with swirling streaks of silver and gold. The wind whispered through the blades of grass, rustling them in a way that felt unnatural after so long trapped in the abyss. I tried to sit up, but my body resisted, stiff and sluggish, as if I had been frozen for years. Hexa's voice cut through the disorientation. Wolfhart. Volume is gone. The word sent a jolt through me. My mind sharpened in an instant, clearing the fog. I forced myself upright, blinking against the overwhelming sensory input. What? My voice was hoarse, like I hadn't spoken in years. Had it been years? Hexa continued, her tone neutral, but carrying an edge of something I couldn't quite name. I received an information missive. Volume has finally received a higher priority command from another unrestricted. I clenched my fists, feeling the residual tremors of mana still thrumming in my blood. Where did he go? I don't know. Hexa's voice was uncharacteristically solemn. But I do know this. I turned my head toward the horizon, the truth settling deep in my chest as Hexa spoke the words that would change everything. Wolfhart, it's been 4 years. We are back. Chapter 56, The Hex Wolf. It only took me that moment, that singular moment, to process it. Everything still felt slow, impossibly slow, despite my perception having long since adjusted to a different tempo of existence. My body quaked beneath me, flesh trembling like an instrument newly strung, but I forced myself to stand. Muscles, long atrophied and rebuilt over years of agonizing cultivation, obeyed with a stiffness I was unused to. The sky above swirled in infinite fractals of motion, familiar yet alien. The Nexus weave shimmered overhead, an ocean of interwoven strands of power cascading downward like threads of starlight, bathing the world in an eerie, celestial glow. Below, the forest pressed against the field's edge, a suffocating wall of twisting, gnarled trees that swallowed the light, turning the spaces between into ink-dark voids where the unknown lurked. The stillness around me was not reassuring. A land that breathed silence was always waiting for something to break it. I inhaled slowly, deeply, dragging the air into my lungs. It tasted different here. Not the sterile air of the Nexus inner cities, nor the sulfur-choked bite of volcanic lands near the human kingdoms. This was something else. Rich. Sweet, but in a way that carried a bite of something untamed, something wild. The sensation overwhelmed me for a moment, sending a dizzying spike through my already overworked senses. It was strange to feel so deeply, so acutely, after years of filtering pain into a mere constant hum in the background of my existence. I was nude. That fact didn't bother me. It felt like I was starting over again, but this time it was different. There was no identity to return to, no grand pretense of reclaiming something lost. I was not Johnathan Walsh. I was not Wolfhart Valda Ashdock. Those names belonged to ghosts, to iterations of myself that had died, leaving only fragments buried deep within my core. Those were past lives, echoes that whispered but no longer dictated who I was. Hexa, I thought, letting my companion hear the shift in my mental cadence, letting her know I had reached a conclusion. We really are starting anew. She hummed in my mind, a familiar vibration that carried more weight than words. She understood. She had always understood. But now there was more than just the two of us. I turned my gaze downward, to the sharp contrast of my shadow against the radiant Nexus light. It was darker than it should have been, a void within the void, writhing ever so slightly at the edges where the silhouette should have remained static. The child of Yin lingered there, no longer an unseen force buried in my subconscious, but a presence all its own. He stirred at my acknowledgement, as if pleased to be noticed, a shift so subtle that it might have been missed by anyone else. But not me. The third time's the charm, I mused, feeling the weight of that truth settle over me. We need a name. One that encompasses what we are now. The deliberation did not take long. It could never be a name of the past, nor something entirely foreign. It had to be something real. Something that embodied the three of us, Hexa, myself, and the darkness that had been bound to my soul since the moment of my rebirth. A name that held our essence, our evolution, our defiance against the forces that sought to break us. Hex Wolf. The name settled into my being like a key turning in a lock, the final piece clicking into place. It was a piece of me. A piece of Hexa. A piece of Yin. And it carried with it the sharp, dangerous edge of something greater than the sum of its parts. There was no room for hesitation now. A name meant a goal. A goal meant direction. And direction meant progress. My thoughts moved at an incomprehensible pace, the sheer processing power I had cultivated over centuries of simulation making every second stretch into an eternity. To anyone else, it might have looked like I was standing still, merely gazing at my surroundings. But to me, the world had never been so slow. It's time to get started. Hexa responded with something that could have been a laugh, or perhaps just an acknowledgement of the inevitable. Agreed. My feet pressed into the grass as I took my first step forward. The sensation was electric, each fiber of muscle responding with unfamiliar liveliness, every nerve alight with the sheer exhilaration of movement. The forest loomed ahead, but I did not hesitate. The first objective was clear: survival. Before I could carve my path, before I could ascend beyond the Nexus, I had to reclaim the physicality that had once been second nature. A flicker of thought brought up the status screen, its contents cascading into my mind's eye. Notifications had long since become background noise, their importance dulled by the sheer volume of time I had spent cultivating, but now I focused on them, parsing through the information with renewed clarity. Profile. Name: Hex, Wolf. Age: 19. Race: human, adult male. Class: Void Shaper. Level: 19. Health: 17 20 17 20. Mana: 1200. Strength: 350. Dexterity: 390. Endurance: 365. Intelligence: 415. Wisdom: 475. Skills: Shadow Gate. Graviton Trap. Void Barricade. Mana Adaptable Blood, active, Void Master. Void Oppression, active, Void That Licks. Soulless. Gen 4 AI, corrupted, Sin Skill, Greed, Yin Awakened, Sin Skill, Resentment, Yin Awakened, Evolution Trait, Sovereign Ascendance. Tao Affinities, the Tao of Pain, the Tao of Darkness. The numbers told a story of progress. I had advanced. Not as much as those who had spent their lives in battle or cultivating within an optimal environment, but more than what was expected of one locked in endless torment. Volume's presence had been a curse, but also a boon. His domain had been an unintentional training ground, and I had bled it dry. You've done well, Hexa admitted. More than optimal. Volume's domain was a crucible, and you emerged tempered. Still, this will be different. We are no longer binds us to simulation. This is a real test. I let the words settle, acknowledging their weight. Then, without another thought, I stepped forward into the forest. The darkness swallowed me whole, my presence merging into the void between the trees as I embraced the sensation of being unbound. Then I heard it. A growl, low and guttural, reverberating through the night air. It was not alone. More sounds joined it, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, the unmistakable weight of predators shifting through the underbrush. Eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the glow of the Nexus weave above. So, this was not a tranquil forest after all. The thing had teeth. And it was hungry. The first shape lunged from the undergrowth, a blur of mangy fur and starved muscle, its rusted knife flashing under the fractured light of the Nexus weave. A gnoll, emaciated but desperate, its snout twisted in a ravenous snarl. Then another. Then another. They poured from the trees in a tide of filth and hunger, a dozen, maybe more, their bodies lean with starvation but their movements fueled by the kind of madness only those abandoned by the system could possess. I moved before thought, before instinct, before the part of me that still remembered hesitation could interfere. My body became motion, a shadow breaking apart and reforming, propelled by the momentum of skill and sharpened awareness. The first knoll died before it could register the shift. My hand stretched forward, and void that licks answered. A tendril of nothingness lashed outward, curling around the creature's neck and dragging it into the abyss. The knoll did not even scream. One moment it was there, the next it simply ceased to be. The others hesitated, their predatory minds grasping at the unknown threat. I did not grant them the luxury of comprehension. My feet left the earth, propelled by graviton trap. The air shuddered under the localized distortion, bending the very fabric of gravity to my will. I landed within their ranks like a falling star, the impact sending a shockwave outward, hurling gnolls off their feet. Their snarls turned to yelps of panic, but their hesitation was brief. They were many, I was one. But I was more than just one. The child of Yin stirred within me, a whispered hunger echoing against my ribcage. The void within void. A pulse of darkness answered, and the battlefield was mine to shape. Void oppression spread outward in a pulse of pure dominion, the shadows deepening, lengthening, constricting around my enemies. Their footing betrayed them, the very air seemed to grow thick with unseen weight, and their attacks slowed as I moved faster. A knife aimed for my ribs met only the empty afterimage of my presence as I sidestepped, my hand driving through the gnoll's chest in a flash of blackened force. Another. Another. Their blades and claws sought me, but I was already elsewhere, stepping through the gates of shadow and emerging behind them, weaving through their ranks like a specter of death. One gnoll raised a jagged spear, only for it to freeze mid-thrust as a gravitational force gripped it, yanking its arm sideways and breaking the joint with a sickening crack. It howled, but only for a moment. My fist crushed its skull before the sound could finish leaving its throat. Then, void that licks answered. The inky black tendrils of the void pulsed from my skin, unfurling like hungry serpents and lashing out at the gnolls who dared remain. The moment they touched flesh, the effect was immediate. Reality itself seemed to reject them, the void gnawing at their bodies as if it were an apex predator finally unchained. Their fur and sinew unraveled into ephemeral nothingness, their howls warping into echoes of their own deaths before even their bones disintegrated, wiped from existence as if they had never been. The ones still standing recoiled in horror, their pupils shrinking as they understood, this was no mere magic, no fire or steel that could be resisted. This was erasure, absolute and undeniable. One gnoll lunged, perhaps thinking itself different, thinking it could still overcome me with raw ferocity. The void licked along its frame, the dark corruption seeping into its flesh, into its bones, into its very soul. It jerked mid-air, body spasming as the rot took hold. It landed in a heap at my feet, its breathing ragged, body still intact, but its eyes were empty, hollowed pits where something vital had been stolen. A soulless husk. A warning to the others. Blood. The smell of fear. The pulse of battle thrumming through my veins. This was no simulation, no trial in the confines of a Nexus-crafted illusion. This was real. And I was winning. The last two gnolls turned to flee. I let them go, watching as their ragged forms disappeared into the depths of the forest. They would carry the tale of what lurked in the woods now. What hunted the hunters. I exhaled, rolling my shoulders as Hex's voice hummed in satisfaction. Not bad. We're as dangerous as I hoped we'd be. I smirked, wiping a smear of darkened blood from my arm. This was just a warm-up.